There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room once the lights go down and the day finally lets go of you. If you are here for that quiet, you are in the right place. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop from your ears. Tonight we are going back nearly 2,000 years to a world that ran on something most of us can barely imagine living beside every day of our lives. Other human beings owned outright the way you might own a plough or a mule or a house. In the Roman world, a person's entire life could be decided in a single afternoon at a market stall by a stranger checking their teeth and their hands the way you might check a horse before a long journey. Whether that person spent the next 30 years in a quiet kitchen or in the choking dark of a mine tunnel was not fate. It was a decision made by someone else, usually in less time than it takes to eat a meal, and it very often determined whether that person would live to see old age at all. Picture a narrow street in Rome just before first light. The air still holds the cool of the night, and somewhere nearby, a rooster is testing its voice. Inside a small bakery near the Forum, a young man is already awake, has been awake for an hour, moving in the dark by feel, because the household cannot yet spare the oil for a second lamp. He is not free. He was not born into this particular house. He arrived here 3 years ago, sold by a trader who bought him further east, and he has learned in that time the exact weight a millstone needs before it will turn without cracking, and the exact sound the dough makes when it has been worked enough. His hands are pale with flour and cracked at the knuckles from the cold water he uses to keep the surface of the bread smooth. He works beside a donkey that is blindfolded so it will keep walking its slow circle without complaint. And there are mornings he has told no one when he envies the animal, because the animal not expected to understand what has happened to it. By the time the baker's wife comes downstairs to check the ovens, he has already shaped 40 loaves. He will be praised for none of them. He will be blamed sharply and immediately for any that burn. This is the arithmetic of his existence, and he has made his peace with it in the only way available to him, which is to become so good at his work that there is simply nothing left to punish. It is a strange kind of freedom carved out of a life with none. He does not know yet whether he will die in this bakery, an old man with flour permanently worked into the lines of his palms, or whether some future owner in a fit of debt or spite will sell him again to somewhere far worse. Nobody in Rome would have thought his morning was remarkable. That more than anything else is the point, because here is what tends to surprise people once they really sit with it. Somewhere close to 1 in 3 people living in Italy during the height of the Roman Republic and the early empire were enslaved. Not a small underclass tucked away and easy to forget, but a vast constant presence woven into nearly every household, with any wealth at all, every workshop, every farm, every ship. The bread you would have eaten in Rome was very likely kneaded by enslaved hands. The wine poured at a dinner party was very likely carried by someone who could be sold the following week and never spoken of again. Roman civilization, the roads, the aqueducts, the leisure and the philosophy and the art we still admire in museums rested on a foundation of human beings who left almost no trace of their own names behind. And that raises a question worth sitting with in the dark tonight. If slavery was this woven into ordinary life, this unremarkable to the people living beside it, what did it actually feel like from the inside? Not the version we get from a handful of famous rebellions, or a handful of philosophers writing comfortably from their villas about the proper way to treat one's property, the real texture of it, what a person ate, what they were afraid of, what small private forms of hope survived even inside a system built to crush them. Historians have spent well over a century piecing this together, from broken pottery, from scratched graffiti on prison walls, from cheap gravestones paid for by grieving friends who were themselves enslaved, and the picture that emerges is far stranger, far more human, and in some ways far more disturbing than the version most of us were taught in school. Before we go further into that world, if this is the kind of history you've been looking for, the kind that takes its time and treats you as someone who deserves the full and honest story, it would mean a great deal if you took just a moment to subscribe and leave the video a like. It genuinely helps this kind of careful long-form storytelling find the people who want it. And if you have a moment, leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from tonight and what drew you to a story like this one. I read every one of them and I am always curious. Now get comfortable, pull the blanket up and let's step all the way into that world. Because the young baker we just watched grinding grain in the dark was not unusual. He was in the strictest sense ordinary, one face among millions who moved through Roman daily life largely unseen by the people who left behind the letters and speeches and histories we still read today. To understand what his life actually cost him, we have to go back further than that bakery, back to where people like him came from in the first place, and how an empire built almost entirely on the labour of others managed to keep such an enormous and constant supply of human beings flowing into its markets, its farms, its mines and its homes. The evidence remains incomplete in places scholars still argue over the precise numbers, but the shape of the machine itself is not in doubt, and it is a machine that began almost always with the sound of a war ending somewhere far from Rome and a long line of frightened, exhausted people being led toward the coast. War rarely announced itself as a slave market. It announced itself as trumpets, as marching feet, as smoke rising over a hillside town that had refused to surrender quickly enough. But by the time the fighting stopped, the two things had become the same event. Rome's endless campaigns of conquest were not simply about territory or tribute. They were from a very early point in the Republic's history one of the largest and most reliable sources of human beings the ancient world had ever seen. Consider what happened after a Roman general finished a successful campaign. Soldiers did not simply march home to parades and rest. Waiting behind the army, often within sight of the battlefield itself, were groups of merchants known as the slave traders, who followed the legions the way vultures follow a storm. They arrived with chains, with rope, with the practiced calm of men who had done this many times before, and they moved through the defeated population sorting people the way a farmer sorts livestock. The young and strong were separated from the old. Children were separated from their mothers, sometimes within the same hour their fathers had died defending them. A person who had been a farmer, a weaver, a teacher of children the day before might find themselves by nightfall walking in a column toward the coast with a rope around their wrists, owning nothing, not even their own name anymore, since a new owner would very often simply rename them. The scale of this is difficult to hold in the mind honestly. When Julius Caesar completed his campaigns in Gaul, ancient writers claim that hundreds of thousands of people were enslaved over the course of that war alone, a number so large that modern historians treat it with some caution, since ancient authors often inflated such figures to flatter a general's achievements. Still, even accounting for exaggeration, the pattern beneath the number is not in dispute. Conquest and slavery moved together, each war feeding the markets that kept the Roman economy running, and each new territory brought under Roman control meant a fresh wave of people arriving in chains at ports like Delos, Ephesus, and eventually Rome itself. There is a detail here that tends to surprise people who assume Roman slavery worked something like the version later, practiced in the Americas, built almost entirely around a single racial group. It did not. A person enslaved in Rome might come from Gaul, from Greece, from Syria, from Numidia, from Britain, from Spain, from the Black Sea coast. Skin colour in the Roman mind mattered far less than the simple legal fact of bondage itself. A Greek tutor teaching a senator's children Latin grammar might be enslaved. So might the man hauling stone in a quarry a few miles outside the city. What united them was not appearance but circumstance, the accident of having been born captured or sold on the losing side of history. This is one of the quieter, stranger truths of the ancient world. and it is part of what made Roman slavery feel to the people living inside it less like a fixed and permanent category, and more like a condition that could, in theory, happen to almost anyone if fortune turned against them badly enough. And fortune did turn constantly in ways that had nothing to do with war at all. A farmer who fell into debt might sell his own children into slavery simply to survive the winter, a practice that Roman law eventually restricted, but never fully eliminated in its earliest centuries. Pirates who controlled long stretches of the Mediterranean coastline for generations, before Pompey finally suppressed them, made a steady business of kidnapping travellers and selling them at the very same markets that processed prisoners of war. Even Julius Caesar himself, as a young man, was famously captured by pirates and held for ransom, an episode he apparently treated with such calm arrogance that he told his captors, half joking, that he would one day return and have them all crucified. He did exactly that once he was freed. It is a strange footnote to carry in mind that the same system of maritime kidnapping which built fortunes for pirates and slave traders alike very nearly claimed the man who would go on to reshape the entire Roman world. The scholars still debate exactly how large the enslaved population of Roman Italy became at its peak, since ancient census records rarely counted enslaved people with any consistency, and the surviving numbers we do have were often recorded for tax purposes rather than any interest in an accurate human count. But even the most conservative modern estimates suggest a population in the millions across the Italian peninsula alone. By the 1st century, a presence so vast that the entire rhythm of Roman daily life, the meals prepared, the roads maintained, the crops harvested, depended on it functioning smoothly and, crucially, on it staying largely invisible to the people who benefited from it. That invisibility was not an accident. It was in its own way a kind of design. Wealthy Roman households took a strange pride in appearing effortless in presenting a dinner party or a well-kept garden, as though it had simply arranged itself, when in truth every plate, every trimmed hedge, every warmed room depended on an enslaved person standing just out of sight, ready to move the moment they were needed, and otherwise expected to disappear into the walls. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that arrangement worth pausing on. To be essential to every comfort in a household and simultaneously invisible within it, present in every room and acknowledged in almost none of them. This brings us back to something worth sitting with quietly. The Roman economy that produced the aqueducts still standing in parts of Europe today, the roads that connected an empire stretching from Britain to the edge of Persia, the leisure that allowed philosophers to write and senators to debate, none of it functioned as a closed system of citizens working for themselves. It functioned because an enormous, constantly replenished population of enslaved people fed raw human labour into every part of it, from the fields that grew Rome's grain to the mines that produced its silver, and from the workshops that built its ships to the kitchens that fed its families. War brought new people in. Debt and piracy kept the supply flowing even during peace. And once a person entered that system, the machine had very specific, very different places prepared for them, depending on nothing more than luck appearance and the particular needs of whoever happened to be buying that day. Some would end up in a comfortable household tutoring children or managing accounts, treated in the strange language of the time almost like a member of the family, so long as they never forgot they were not one. Others would end up somewhere far harsher, somewhere the sunlight barely reached at all, doing work that wore a person down within a handful of years rather than a lifetime. The line between those two fates could be as thin as a buyer's passing mood on the day of the sale, and it is that moment of sale itself, the auction block, the inspection, the precise mechanics of turning a human being into a listed price, that the story turns to next. The island of Delos sits in the middle of the Aegean, small enough that a person could walk across it in an afternoon, and yet for a stretch of roughly a century it functioned as one of the busiest human marketplaces the ancient world had ever produced. Ancient writers claimed that on its busiest days, tens of thousands of people could be bought and sold before the sun went down. A figure modern historians view with real skepticism, since no reliable count survives and the number seems to have grown with each retelling. What is not in question is the reputation the island carried. To be taken to Delos meant one thing: you were entering the final stage of becoming someone else's possession. The journey there was often worse than what waited at the end of it. People captured in distant wars or seized by pirates along a coastline, or sold off by their own families during a famine, were packed into the holds of ships for days or weeks at a time, given barely enough food to keep them alive, since a trader's profit depended on delivering bodies that could still stand upright rather than bodies that were well fed. Illness spread easily in those conditions, and it was common enough that traders openly accepted a certain percentage of their human cargo would not survive the voyage. There was no name for this loss in the account books beyond ordinary spoilage, the same term a merchant might use for grain that rotted before it reached port. Those who did survive the journey arrived to find the market itself built for inspection, not dignity. Some were displayed standing on raised platforms so that buyers moving through the crowd could see them clearly from a distance, the way one might display cattle at auction. Their feet were often marked with chalk, a plain practical signal to any buyer walking past that this particular person had just arrived from overseas and had not yet been sold in any other market. It told a buyer nothing about who the person was. It told them only that the merchandise, as the traders would have called it, was fresh. Buyers did not simply glance and choose, they inspected the way a person might inspect a horse before a long journey, checking teeth for signs of age or poor health, checking hands for calluses that revealed what kind of labour a person had already been trained to endure, checking eyes and posture for anything that suggested illness or exhaustion that might shorten a working life. Roman law remarkably required sellers to disclose known defects, physical or otherwise, and surviving legal texts list an oddly specific set of conditions a buyer could sue over afterward if they had not been warned. A tendency to run away, a history of theft, epilepsy. It is a strange thing to sit with that Roman commercial law, took more care to protect a buyer's investment than it ever did to protect the person being bought, and yet both of those facts existed within the very same legal system, side by side, without anyone at the time appearing to notice the contradiction. Consider for a moment a particular kind of person moving through that crowd at Delos. Not the trader, not the buyer, but someone standing on the platform itself waiting. History does not preserve her name, and this is worth sitting with honestly, because it is true of almost everyone who passed through markets like this one. What we can reconstruct from surviving contracts and legal records describing sales just like hers is the shape of the moment rather than the person. She has likely travelled from somewhere along the coast of Asia Minor, taken during a local conflict that barely registers in the surviving histories of the period, the kind of small, forgotten war that produced enormous suffering without ever earning its own chapter in a Roman senator's memoirs. She has spent close to 3 weeks in the hold of a ship, and her feet, like everyone else's around her, carry the chalk marking she arrived with. A buyer approaches, a household steward sent to acquire domestic help for a wealthy family in Rome, and he examines her hands first the way he's been trained to, looking for the rough calluses that would suggest years of fieldwork rather than the finer domestic skills his employer is looking for. He asks the trader a handful of questions. He does not ask her anything at all. Within perhaps 10 minutes, a price is settled, a transaction is recorded, and she is led away toward a ship bound for Italy, carrying nothing of her old life except the clothes on her back and whatever fragments of memory no one could take from her. This is in its quiet way one of the most disorienting truths of the entire system. The sale itself, the single event that determined the entire remaining shape of a person's life, whether they would spend the next 30 years in a comfortable household or dead within 5 in a mine often took less time than a modern person spends choosing a piece of furniture. There was no ceremony to it, no acknowledgement of what was actually occurring. It was for the buyer an unremarkable Tuesday. What happened next carried a weight the sale itself did not. Roman households and Roman society more broadly treated the renaming of an enslaved person as an entirely ordinary part of ownership, no different in principle from labelling any other newly acquired property. A person's original name, the name their mother had given them, the name that carried the sound of a language and a homeland they would very likely never see again, was frequently discarded within hours of arrival, replaced with something the new household found easier to pronounce, or something that reflected where they had supposedly come from, or in a detail that still unsettles historians thus studying the surviving records, something the owner simply found amusing. Names like Fortunatus, meaning fortunate, appear again and again in the historical record attached to enslaved people, a small bitter irony that Roman owners do not appear to have found troubling at all. The evidence remains incomplete regarding how enslaved people themselves felt about this particular loss, since almost none of them left behind their own written accounts. What we do have comes largely from inscriptions, brief funerary texts commissioned by grieving friends or family members who were often enslaved themselves, and a striking number of these inscriptions include both names, the given Roman name, and carved in smaller letters beneath it an attempt to preserve the sound of the name that had been taken. It suggests, without ever stating it outright, that the loss of one's original name was felt as something worth quietly resisting, even from within a system that offered almost no space to resist anything at all. There is a deeper mechanism at work in all of this worth pausing on, because it explains something about why the Roman slave trade functioned as smoothly and as coldly as it did for so many centuries. Renaming a person, stripping away the visible markers of where they came from, examining their body for market value rather than asking who they were. All of it served the same quiet function. It transformed a human being into a category that was easier to think about and easier to act upon without discomfort. This was not unique to Rome, and scholars studying systems of bondage across many different periods of history have identified the same pattern again and again: the deliberate erasure of identity as a tool that makes ownership psychologically survivable for the people doing the owning. Rome did not invent this cruelty. It simply refined it into an efficient, everyday commercial practice conducted in broad daylight in a marketplace on a small island with the same unremarkable calm as any other transaction of the ancient world. And once that transaction closed, once the chalk was washed from someone's feet and a new name had been assigned to them, the person who walked away from that platform was in every legal and practical sense the Roman world recognized no longer quite the person who had walked onto it. What awaited them on the other side of that sale depended entirely on where their new owner intended to put them to work, and it is there in the specific and very different destinations that awaited enslaved people across the Roman economy that the true range of this system's cruelty becomes fully visible. The destinations that awaited someone once they left a market like Delos were not chosen at random, and they were not chosen kindly. A buyer's decision rested on a simple cold calculation what kind of labour was needed, and how long a person might reasonably be expected to survive doing it. For some, that calculation led toward a kitchen or a garden. For others, it led toward the earth itself, down into places where daylight was a memory rather than a daily fact of life. The silver mines of Spain, particularly the vast complex at a site the Romans called Rio Tinto, absorbed enslaved labour on a scale that is difficult to picture clearly even now. Ancient writers describe tens of thousands of people working these mines at any given time, cutting galleries deep into hillsides, using little more than iron picks, wooden props, and small clay oil lamps that gave off barely enough light to see the rock in front of a person's face. The tunnels themselves were often narrow enough that only a child or a very small adult could move through certain passages, and this is one of the details modern visitors to these sites find hardest to absorb honestly. Roman mining operations relied specifically on enslaved children for some of the tightest, most dangerous shafts, sending them into spaces too narrow for a grown man to fit into at all. A child's smaller body was not a disadvantage in this particular economy. It was a specification. The air itself in these tunnels carried its own quiet violence. Oil lamps burning for hours in an unventilated shaft consumed the available oxygen and left behind smoke that settled into a person's lungs day after day, year after year. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing not long after these mines reached their peak output, described workers so blackened by soot and mineral dust that visitors compared their skin to the colour of the rock they were extracting. And while his account carries the kind of vivid exaggeration common to ancient travel writing, the underlying reality it points toward is not exaggerated at all. Silicosis, a slow and irreversible scarring of the lungs caused by prolonged exposure to fine mineral dust, would have been a near certainty for anyone spending years in these conditions, though. Of course, no one at the time had a name for what was happening inside these workers' chests. They simply understood in the plain language available to them that a person sent into the mines did not usually last long, and did not usually come back out again in any condition that resembled the person who went in. Scholars still debate exactly how enslaved miners were housed and fed during this period, since detailed Roman records from Spain are far sparser than the ones that survive from Italy itself. What archaeological evidence does exist: chains recovered from mine entrances, small barracks-style structures built directly into hillsides near the tunnel. Mouths suggests a system designed for one purpose only: to keep a body capable of working for as many hours a day as possible, with as little invested in its comfort as the operation could manage. There was no expectation in these particular mines that a person would grow old in their work the way our baker did in his bakery. The average working life of an enslaved miner is impossible to state with precision, but the surviving evidence points toward a grim consistency, a matter of a small handful of years before exhaustion, injury, or lung disease ended what the mine had begun. Above ground on the vast agricultural estates the Romans called latifundia, a different but related cruelty took shape, one built less around sudden danger and more around relentless grinding repetition. These estates, some stretching across thousands of acres in southern Italy and Sicily, ran almost entirely on enslaved field labour, organised with a precision that Roman writers on agriculture, men like Cato the Elder, discussed with the same detached practicality they might apply to livestock management. Cato's surviving writings on running a farm include almost in passing recommendations for the minimum food ration a field worker required to remain functional, calculated by season and by the intensity of the work being performed, with slightly more grain allotted during the harvest and slightly less during quieter months. He advises selling off enslaved workers once age or injury made them less useful, the same casual tone a modern person might use discussing outdated equipment. It is worth sitting with for a moment what it means that this kind of calculation survives to us not as a hidden shame but as ordinary agricultural advice written down and shared openly among Roman landowners as sound business practice. Is it possible, one might wonder, that anyone living inside a system built this coldly ever found a way to endure it with some measure of dignity intact? The honest answer drawn from what fragments of evidence survive is that some clearly did in small and fiercely guarded ways the historical record only partially preserves. Field workers on latifundia were often housed together in cramped barracks called ergastula, frequently built partly underground and secured at night, and yet even within these confined spaces, archaeologists have found evidence of small personal items: a carved bone token, a simple ring, a scratched initial on a wall, quiet signs that people found ways to hold on to some sliver of individual identity, even when the system around them was built specifically to erase it. The evidence remains incomplete, and historians are cautious about reading too much meaning into a handful of scattered objects, but the pattern recurs often enough across different sites to suggest something real and human beneath it, a stubborn refusal to disappear entirely even under conditions designed to make exactly that happen. There is a deeper current running beneath both the mines and the fields worth naming, plainly because it explains something that puzzled even Roman writers of the period. Unlike domestic slavery, which at least occasionally allowed for some path toward eventual freedom, mining and heavy agricultural labour were in practice closer to a slow sentence of death than a form of ownership a person might reasonably hope to survive and outlast. The Roman economy understood this distinction clearly, even if it rarely spoke of it in such stark terms. A household slave represented an investment worth protecting over years or decades. A mine worker represented a resource to be consumed as efficiently as possible before being replaced. The same logic a modern operation might apply to fuel rather than to personnel. This distinction, more than almost anything else in the Roman system, reveals how completely economic calculation had replaced any consideration of the people caught inside it. And yet even here, in conditions built to grind away everything except labour itself, the Roman world could not fully erase the fact that these were still undeniably human beings capable of memory, of quiet resistance, of small unspoken bonds formed with the person working beside them in the dark. That thread, the persistence of something recognisably human, even under the harshest possible conditions Rome could construct, carries forward into a very different setting, one far closer to comfort on its surface, and yet in its own quieter way no less complicated. Inside a wealthy household, slavery did not look like the mines or the fields at all, and this is exactly what made it its own particular kind of difficult to bear. There were no chains visible in these rooms, no overseer with a whip standing over a furrow of dirt. Instead, there was proximity, constant, unbroken proximity to the very people who owned you, and a closeness that could just as easily turn tender as it could turn cruel sometimes within the same afternoon. Consider the role of the pedagogos, a position that surprises many people learning about Roman households for the first time. This was typically an educated, often Greek-born enslaved man, responsible for walking a young Roman boy to his lessons every day, correcting his manners, teaching him rhetoric, sometimes shaping his entire intellectual formation from early childhood into adolescence. Some of these men were treated with genuine, lasting affection by the families they served, remembered fondly in letters written decades later by the grown men they had once tutored as boys. And yet that same pedagogos remained in every legal sense property. He could be sold the following week if the household's finances required it, regardless of how many years he had spent shaping a child's mind, regardless of any bond that had formed between them. Affection and ownership existed side by side in these households without any apparent contradiction troubling the people living inside them. The same closeness applied to the women who served as wet nurses, called nutresses, often enslaved themselves, who breastfed and raised infant children of the household during their earliest, most vulnerable years. Roman writers occasionally describe grown adults recalling their nutrix with a warmth bordering on love, the kind of unguarded affection a person might feel toward the only steady presence of their earliest memory. And still that same woman had no guarantee of remaining near the child she had nursed once her usefulness ended. She might be kept on for years. She might be sold the moment a household needed money elsewhere. There was no promise built into the relationship at all, only the quiet, ever-present possibility of separation hanging over even its warmest moments. This proximity cut both ways and not always gently, because enslaved people lived so closely inside these households, sharing hallways, kitchens, even sleeping spaces near their owners. they were also uniquely exposed to violence that never had to leave the walls of a private home to occur. Roman law placed almost no meaningful limit on how an owner could treat someone they held in bondage. A household could discipline an enslaved person through whipping for a broken plate for a delayed meal, for nothing more than an owner's foul mood on a difficult day, and no outside authority would ever intervene because Roman law simply did not recognize this as a matter deserving intervention. Enslaved people existed legally closer to property than to persons, and this single fact shaped nearly everything else about how they were treated behind closed doors. There is a detail here that tends to unsettle people once they learn it clearly, because it reveals just how deeply this legal reality was built into ordinary Roman life. If an enslaved person needed to give testimony in a Roman court, their word was not considered reliable on its own. Roman legal procedure required that testimony from enslaved witnesses be extracted specifically under torture, a formal legal process known as quaestio per tormenta, on the reasoning that only pain could guarantee a truthful answer from someone with no independent legal standing to protect. This was not considered cruelty by the standards of the time. It was considered proper legal method discussed by Roman jurists in the same measured procedural language they used for any other courtroom rule. The most widely accepted reconstruction holds that this practice, however routine it appears in the surviving legal texts, was applied with varying severity depending on the case and the region, though the underlying principle that an enslaved person's word required physical coercion to be believed at all remained constant across the empire for centuries. And here the household reveals its darkest and most instructive contradiction, one worth sitting with quietly. In the year 61, during the reign of the Emperor Nero, a Roman senator named Pedanius Secundus was murdered inside his own home, apparently by one of his own enslaved men. Roman custom held an old and brutal rule for exactly this situation, one that had existed for generations without frequent need to enforce it at this scale. If a master was killed by his own slave, every enslaved person living under that same roof was to be executed regardless of whether they had any knowledge of the crime at all, on the reasoning that their silence, whether from fear or complicity, made them equally guilty. Pedanius Secundus owned some 400 people. The prospect of executing all of them, including elderly household staff, children, and people almost certainly innocent of any involvement, was severe enough that it provoked open outcry among the ordinary people of Rome, who gathered near the Senate house in protest. What followed inside the Senate itself is one of the more striking and lesser-known debates to survive from this period. A senator named Gaius Cassius Longinus rose to argue coldly and deliberately that the ancient custom must be upheld precisely because it was harsh, since fear alone, he argued, was the only force reliably holding such an enormous enslaved population in check across the entire empire. If exceptions were made for sympathy or innocence, he warned the entire system of control built on terror would begin to unravel. The Senate, after considerable debate, agreed with him. All 400 were executed, and Roman soldiers reportedly had to line the route to prevent the crowd from intervening. Scholars still debate exactly how representative this episode was of everyday household relations, since Cassius' argument itself suggests that many Romans found the custom troubling, even at the time uncomfortable enough to require open public defense in front of the Senate. It stands as one of the clearest surviving moments where Rome's own citizens confronted directly and uncomfortably the true cost of the system their comfort depended upon. Not every household, of course, operated under this same shadow of potential mass violence, and it would be dishonest to suggest that every enslaved person living inside a Roman home experienced only fear. The philosopher and statesman Cicero wrote with what appears to be genuine grief about the death of his enslaved secretary Tiro's health scare, worrying over him in letters to friends with the kind of language a person might use for a valued companion rather than a piece of property. Tiro himself remarkably was eventually freed, and went on to become an accomplished author in his own right, credited even with inventing a shorthand writing system used for centuries after his death. His story, however, remains the exception precisely because it was preserved at all written down by a famous owner who happened to value him enough to mention him by name. For every Tiro whose story survives, countless others lived and died inside Roman households, leaving no trace beyond perhaps a single line on a cheap gravestone paid for by a fellow enslaved friend. What made domestic slavery its own particular form of difficulty then was not simply cruelty, since cruelty existed everywhere across this system, in the mines, in the fields, on the auction platforms. It was the specific disorienting mixture of genuine closeness and total legal powerlessness existing in the very same relationship, sometimes in the very same room, sometimes even in the very same afternoon. A child might genuinely love the person who raised them, and that same child grown into an adult, managing the household finances, might sell that same person without a second thought if circumstances required it. Was affection under these conditions ever entirely free of its own quiet cruelty? It is a question Roman households themselves never seem to have asked out loud, and its unspoken presence lingers over nearly every domestic scene the surviving evidence allows us to reconstruct. This particular arrangement, comfort and danger sharing the same roof, the same table, sometimes the same bed, could not last forever without producing resistance somewhere within it. And it is in exactly this tension between a system that demanded total obedience and human beings who remained underneath everything, still capable of refusing, that the story now turns towards the moment Rome's confidence in its own control was tested most severely by a man who had once stood like so many others on a platform very much like the one at Delos. A training school in the town of Capua held a particular kind of danger that its owners rarely thought about carefully enough because it gathered together under one roof exactly the kind of men Roman society least wanted concentrated in one place. Gladiators were in the eyes of Roman law still enslaved property purchased specifically for their strength and trained specifically to fight sometimes to the death for the entertainment of the very people who owned them. And in the year 73 before the Common Era, inside one such school, run by a man named Lentulus Batiatus, a group of these men decided they had endured enough. The historical record around what happened next is thinner than most people assume given how famous the story eventually became. Ancient sources, principally the historians Plutarch and Appian, writing more than a century after the events they describe, agree on the broad shape of what occurred, but differ on many of the smaller details, including the exact number of men involved in the initial escape, which ranges across the surviving accounts from a few dozen to around 200. What is generally agreed upon is this: a group of gladiators using kitchen implements. They managed to seize by force, fought their way past the guards holding them, and fled the school, making their way toward the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. A mountain that at the time no one yet understood was a dormant volcano other than simply an unusually fertile hill. Among these escaped men was a Thracian named Spartacus, about whom remarkably little verified personal history survives. Ancient writers describe him variously as a former soldier who had once served in a Roman auxiliary unit before being captured or deserting, and as a man of unusual intelligence and physical bearing, though scholars caution that such descriptions written long after his death by authors who never met him were likely shaped as much by the drama of the story that followed as by any reliable personal detail. What we can say with more confidence is that he emerged, whether by earlier military experience, natural bearing, or simple circumstance, as one of the group's leaders almost immediately. What happened over the following months surprised Rome in a way that few uprisings ever had not, because a group of escaped gladiators posed some immediate military threat on their own, but because of how quickly their numbers grew. Word of the escape spread through the countryside of southern Italy, and enslaved field workers, herdsmen, and labourers from the very estates we spoke of earlier began leaving their posts to join them, drawn by the simple radical possibility that escape might actually be survivable. Within a matter of months, this group of a few hundred escaped gladiators had grown, according to ancient estimates that modern historians treat with appropriate caution, into a force numbering in the tens of thousands, most of them people with no military training at all, armed, initially with little more than farm tools and the improvised weapons they could scavenge. Rome's early response reveals something important about how the city genuinely perceived this threat at first, which is to say not very seriously. The Senate initially dispatched a relatively small force under a praetor named Claudius Glaber, essentially treating the matter as routine policing rather than a serious military campaign, the kind of response one might send after bandits rather than an organised army. Glaber's forces attempted to trap the escaped group on the slopes of Vesuvius by blocking the single known path down the mountain, assuming the position left the fugitives with no way out. According to the surviving accounts, the escaped men wove ropes from wild vines growing on the mountainside and used them to climb down a steep unguarded cliff face, under cover of darkness, circling behind Glaber's camp and overwhelming his soldiers in a surprise attack. It was a small victory in purely military terms, but its psychological effect was enormous. A group Rome had dismissed as a policing matter had just defeated an official Roman military force in the field. From that point forward, the uprising grew into something Rome could no longer treat casually, though it would take considerable time and several further military defeats before that shift in perception fully arrived. Over roughly 2 years, the growing army moved across the Italian peninsula, and its numbers, along with the composition of who joined it, tell us something worth pausing on quietly. This was never simply about escape into hiding. Many of the people who joined were by every account ordinary enslaved agricultural workers and household staff, the same category of people we have spent this entire evening getting to know, choosing when the opportunity briefly appeared to risk everything rather than remain where they were. Scholars still debate exactly what the ultimate goal of the movement actually was, since the ancient sources themselves disagree. Some ancient accounts suggest an intention to cross the Alps and disperse the fighters back to their various homelands across Gaul and Thrace. Others suggest plans shifted over time, perhaps towards sailing to Sicily, perhaps eventually toward marching on Rome itself, though this last possibility receives less support among modern historians than popular retellings often suggest. The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty which of these possibilities the movement's leaders actually pursued, or whether their aim shifted as circumstances changed around them. There is a detail here that rarely makes it into popular versions of this story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it complicates any simple narrative of unified rebellion. The ancient sources describe real disagreement within the growing army itself over strategy and direction. Disagreement serious enough that the group apparently split at certain points, with some contingents moving in different directions than others, occasionally with disastrous results when smaller groups were caught and destroyed separately by Roman forces. This was not, in other words, a single unified movement marching with one clear purpose from beginning to end. It was a vast, loosely organized collection of people who had each individually chosen the same desperate risk, united by circumstance and necessity rather than by any single settled plan, doing their best to hold together something that Roman military discipline was specifically built to pull apart. Is it possible, one might wonder quietly, that Rome's fear of this uprising had less to do with its actual military threat and more to do with what it represented? The honest answer suggested by the historical record is very likely yes. An army of several thousand escaped enslaved people was in purely tactical terms a serious but ultimately manageable problem for an empire that could field legions numbering in the hundreds of thousands across its territories. What made the uprising genuinely alarming to Roman society was the idea underneath it, the plain dangerous suggestion that the enormous population Rome depended upon for its daily comfort might, under the right circumstances, simply decide to stop cooperating. That idea, more than any battlefield defeat, is what Rome could not afford to let stand unanswered. And how thoroughly and how permanently Rome eventually chose to answer it is a story that unfolds along a road most people alive today have never heard the true story of, though its name has survived for nearly 2,000 years. The final months of the uprising unfolded with a grimness that ancient writers, even those working a century after the events, described with unusual restraint, as though the ending itself needed little embellishment to carry its full weight. Command of the Roman response eventually fell to a wealthy senator named Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man better remembered in most histories for his fortune than his generalship, who took on the campaign partly, ancient sources suggest, because he recognized what defeating this particular threat could do for his political standing. Crassus inherited an army that had already suffered several embarrassing defeats, and one of his first actions reveals just how seriously Rome now understood the danger. When an early detachment of his own forces broke ranks and fled during an engagement, Crassus revived an old and rarely used punishment called decimation, in which 1 out of every 10 soldiers in the disgraced unit was selected by lot and executed by his own comrades regardless of individual conduct, purely as a demonstration that retreat would be punished as severely as any battlefield loss. It is a striking detail that the harshest discipline of this entire campaign was first turned inward against Rome's own soldiers before it was ever turned against the people they were pursuing. The message apparently needed reinforcing on both sides of the conflict. Over the following months, Crassus pushed the remaining fighters weakened by earlier losses and increasingly cut off from supplies into the southern tip of the Italian peninsula, attempting at one point to trap them entirely by building a fortified line stretching across the narrow land bridge leading toward the coast. The surviving accounts describe the fighters eventually breaking through this barrier in a desperate winter crossing, though the ancient sources disagree on exactly how, some suggesting a direct assault under cover of a storm, others suggesting a quieter escape through a gap in the fortifications. What is generally agreed upon is that a final major battle followed not long after somewhere in the region of Lucania, and that it ended in the near total destruction of the uprising's remaining forces. Spartacus himself is believed to have died in this final engagement, though here the historical record grows notably uncertain in a way worth acknowledging, honestly rather than smoothing over. Ancient writers claim his body was never conclusively identified among the dead, a detail that has fed centuries of later speculation and storytelling, though modern historians treat this simply as the ordinary chaos of an ancient battlefield rather than anything more mysterious. Thousands of bodies stripped of any distinguishing insignia, since the fighters had never worn uniforms to begin with, would have made any individual identification effectively impossible in the aftermath, whatever stories later grew up around the uncertainty. What happened next is the detail most people, if they know anything at all about this uprising, tend to remember, and it deserves to be understood plainly rather than dramatically, because its true purpose was never the suffering of any one person. Crassus ordered approximately 6,000 surviving fighters captured in the campaign's final weeks executed along the entire length of the Appian Way, the great road stretching roughly 130 miles from Capua, where the uprising had first begun, all the way to the gates of Rome itself. For any traveller making that journey in the months that followed, the road offered a continuous, unbroken reminder, visible for its entire length, of what happened to those who challenged the system Rome depended upon. This was not, historians are careful to note, an act of uncontrolled cruelty or battlefield rage. It was something colder, and in its own way more calculated, a deliberate piece of public messaging aimed less at the men who had already died, and more at everyone who would travel that road afterwards, and particularly at the millions of enslaved people still living and working across Roman Italy, who would hear about it or eventually see it themselves. Rome was not simply punishing rebellion. It was demonstrating in the most visible and enduring way available to it exactly what the cost of imagining a different life would be. The historical record leaves us with a genuinely difficult question to sit with, honestly, one that ancient writers themselves never fully resolved. Did this punishment succeed in its purpose? In the most immediate sense, certainly no comparable uprising of this scale occurred again in Roman Italy for the remainder of the empire's history, and Roman writers in later generations occasionally referenced the episode as proof that firm, visible punishment was the only reliable safeguard against a repeat. And yet the scale of the response also reveals something Rome rarely admitted openly, which is how deeply frightened its own ruling class had been by the possibility that the enormous population it depended upon might simply decide even briefly that survival mattered more than obedience. A society that requires 6,000 crucifixions along its most travelled road to feel secure again is not whatever its writers claimed afterward, a society that ever felt entirely safe in what it had built. There is one further detail worth including here, quieter than the road itself, but perhaps more revealing of how Rome chose to remember this moment. Pompey's a rival general, returning from a separate campaign in Spain, encountered a smaller group of fighters who had fled the main battle, defeated them easily, and then wrote to the Senate claiming that he rather than Crassus deserved the true credit for ending the uprising, since Crassus had merely defeated the slaves in open battle, while he himself had, in his own words, torn out the roots of the war entirely. It is a small, almost petty footnote, two powerful Roman men competing for political credit over the suppression of an uprising fought by people neither of them ever named individually in the surviving record. It tells us something about how thoroughly, even in victory, Rome's own account of these events centered entirely on Roman ambition, leaving barely a trace of the people who had actually lived and died along that long, terrible road. And so the system held, at least for the moment, its authority reinforced through fear, rather than resolved through any change in the conditions that had produced the uprising in the first place. But holding a system together through fear and believing in the fairness of that same system are two very different things, and it is that second, quieter question of what Rome actually told itself about the morality of owning other human beings that the story turns to next, into the private thoughts of the very philosophers who dined in comfort, while systems like this one made that comfort possible. A Roman senator named Seneca, tutor and later advisor to the Emperor Nero, once sat down to write a letter to a friend named Lucilius that reads, even now, almost startlingly progressive for its time. In it he argues that enslaved people are in every way that matters, made of the same substance as their owners, that they breathe the same air, feel the same fear, and deserve to be spoken to with basic courtesy, rather than treated as furniture that happens to speak. He criticizes owners who humiliate the people serving their dinner tables purely for entertainment, and he suggests in a line that has been quoted by historians for centuries since, that a person should treat those beneath them the way they would wish to be treated by those above them. It is worth pausing here, because if this were the whole of the story, it might sound almost reassuring. It is not the whole of the story. Seneca, throughout the years he wrote these words, owned enslaved people himself, managed a substantial personal fortune built in part on their labour, and at no point in his surviving writing does he call for the actual abolition of the system he was describing with such apparent compassion. His advice was about kindness within slavery, not freedom from it. He argued in essence that an owner ought to remember the shared humanity of the people they owned, while continuing without contradiction in his own mind to own them. Scholars still debate exactly how sincerely Seneca held these views, versus how much they functioned as a kind of philosophical fashion among Rome's educated elite, a way of appearing thoughtful and humane, without actually disturbing the economic foundation their entire way of life rested upon. The honest answer is probably a mixture of both, in proportions no surviving text allows us to measure precisely. This same tension appears in a slightly different form in the writings of Pliny the Younger, a Roman senator and writer from a generation after Seneca, who describes with evident distress the illness and eventual death of several of his own household staff, writing to friends in language that sounds on its surface indistinguishable from grief for family members. He mentions granting certain enslaved people in his household small personal allowances, permission to draft simple wills distributing whatever modest possessions they had accumulated, even though such wills carried no actual legal standing since property could not itself own property under Roman law. It was a gesture that cost Pliny very little, and changed the underlying legal reality not at all, and yet the letters suggest he found genuine comfort in believing it mattered a small, private fiction that allowed a slaveholder to feel he was being generous within a system he showed no interest in questioning at its foundation. There is a deeper pattern worth naming plainly here, because it explains something that puzzled even later readers of these philosophers centuries removed from Roman society: Stoic philosophy. The school of thought both Seneca and in his own way Pliny drew from taught that true freedom was an internal spiritual condition rather than an external legal one. A person's body might be enslaved. Stoic writers argued while their mind and character remained entirely free, untouched by circumstance, capable of virtue and dignity, regardless of their legal status. It is in certain respects a genuinely compassionate idea offering enslaved readers, and there is some evidence enslaved people themselves did read and draw comfort from these ideas, a framework for maintaining personal dignity under conditions designed to strip it away entirely. And yet this same philosophy examined honestly also provided Roman slaveholders with an extraordinarily convenient excuse to leave the actual legal system entirely untouched. If freedom was fundamentally an internal spiritual matter, then the physical condition of ownership became in a sense almost beside the point, a mere circumstance rather than a genuine injustice requiring correction. Epictetus, perhaps the most remarkable figure in this entire tradition, had himself been enslaved for years before eventually gaining his freedom and becoming one of the most respected philosophers in the Roman world, and even his own teachings, shaped by that lived experience, focused overwhelmingly on cultivating internal acceptance rather than calling for the abolition of the system that had once held him. It is a genuinely difficult thing to sit with quietly that the one major Stoic voice who had actually lived through enslavement himself did not use his philosophy to argue against the institution itself, but rather to teach others how to endure it, or in his own case how he had endured it with dignity and tact. Is it possible one might wonder that this was less a moral failure of imagination and more a simple reflection of how completely slavery was woven into the basic economic structure of the ancient world, so thoroughly assumed as a permanent feature of civilization that questioning its existence entirely would have seemed to a Roman mind roughly as strange as questioning whether crops needed to be harvested at all? The evidence remains incomplete regarding how many Romans, if any, genuinely imagined a world without slavery as even a theoretical possibility, since virtually no surviving text from this period argues for outright abolition in the way later centuries would come to understand that term. What Roman moral philosophy offered instead was something narrower, and in its own quiet way more revealing of the limits of even its most humane thinkers. guidance on how to be a better master, never guidance on how to stop being one. This contradiction reaches its sharpest, most concrete expression in Roman law itself, which drew a hard and consistent line between moral sentiment and legal reality, regardless of how any individual philosopher happened to feel personally. Roman jurists writing legal commentary during this same period continued to classify enslaved people in the precise, technical language of the law as res, meaning things the identical legal category applied to furniture, livestock, and tools. A person could write with real feeling about the shared humanity of those they owned in a private letter to a friend, and sign a legal document the very same afternoon that referred to those same people using language indistinguishable from an inventory of farm equipment. Roman law never fully resolved this tension throughout the entire span of the empire's history, and in certain respects it never seriously attempted to, content instead to let private moral sentiment and public legal structure operate as two entirely separate systems that happened to describe the exact same human beings. What eventually did soften, however gradually and however incompletely, was not the underlying legal category itself, but rather certain narrow protections layered on top of it. Protections that reveal almost by accident just how unregulated conditions must have been before they existed at all. The Emperor Claudius issued a ruling declaring that owners who abandoned sick or elderly enslaved people, leaving them to die rather than pay for their care, could no longer reclaim them as property if they happened to recover a small legal correction that only makes sense against the backdrop of owners who had apparently commonly enough to require imperial attention been doing exactly that. Later emperors, including Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, introduced further limited restrictions prohibiting an owner from killing an enslaved person outright without cause, and requiring at least on paper that particularly cruel owners could in rare and difficult circumstances be compelled to sell someone to a different household. These were narrow mercies applied inconsistently, and resting entirely on an owner's willingness to be reported, and a magistrate's willingness to act. But their mere existence tells us plainly that the conditions they were designed to prevent had at some point become common enough that even an empire generally uninterested in protecting enslaved people felt compelled to draw some kind of line. The picture that emerges from all of this, examined honestly rather than charitably, is not one of a society that had somehow reconciled cruelty and conscience, but rather one that had simply learned to hold both at once without ever fully looking at the contradiction directly. Kindness existed genuinely in countless private moments we will never have full record of. So did an unshaken legal and philosophical framework that never seriously questioned whether the entire arrangement should exist in the first place. And it is precisely this uneasy coexistence of real compassion operating comfortably alongside real ownership that quietly shaped the one narrow path that did exist for an enslaved person to change their circumstances entirely, a path that, as the story turns to next, offered less freedom than it first appeared to promise. There existed within Roman law an actual formal ceremony for turning a piece of property back into a citizen, and the strangeness of this process is worth sitting with, because it reveals just how deeply Rome had built the entire concept of slavery into its legal imagination. The most common method, called manumissio vindicta, required an owner to appear before a magistrate along with the enslaved person and a third party who would formally touch that person with a small rod, called a vindicta, declaring them free in a specific ritual language, after which the magistrate would confirm the declaration and the transformation in the eyes of Roman law was considered complete. A person's entire legal existence could shift in the span of a few spoken sentences, and the touch of a stick from property to citizen, and this ceremony so central to an enslaved person's deepest hope, was treated by Roman legal text with the same dry procedural language used for property transfers of any other kind. Manumission happened far more often in Rome than most people assume when they first encounter this history, and this alone tends to surprise people because it does not fit comfortably alongside the darker realities we have spent this evening exploring. Estimates vary considerably, and scholars still debate how representative any single figure actually was across different regions and time periods. But surviving inscriptions from the city of Rome itself suggest that a meaningful percentage of the enslaved population, particularly those in urban households, rather than agricultural estates, could reasonably expect the possibility of eventual freedom within their lifetime. This was not, however, an act of charity in the way it might sound at first. Roman owners frequently used the promise of eventual manumission as a deliberate management tool, an incentive dangled in front of enslaved people to encourage loyal, diligent service over years or even decades, sometimes explicitly written into private agreements specifying a certain sum of money an enslaved person could save and eventually offer their owner in exchange for freedom, a practice that allowed owners to extract maximum value from years of labor before finally releasing someone often only once. Their most physically capable years had already passed. Consider what this arrangement actually meant in practice for someone living inside it. A talented household manager, a skilled craftsman, a woman entrusted with running an owner's business affairs. These were precisely the kinds of enslaved people most likely to eventually gain freedom, not out of any particular sentiment, but because their owners had built genuine trust in their competence over years of close dependent service. The path to freedom, in other words, ran directly through demonstrating oneself to be maximally valuable and maximally compliant within the very system that held them an arrangement that rewarded exactly the qualities most useful to an owner, rather than any independent notion of merit or justice. And here is where the story complicates itself in a way that rarely makes it into simpler retellings. Freedom once granted was never quite complete. A freed person called a libertus, if male, or a liberta, if female, gained Roman citizenship in a limited form, but remained bound to their former owner, now referred to as their patron through an ongoing set of legal and social obligations known as obsequium. A freed person owed their former owner continued respect, certain forms of labour, or financial support if requested, and could not under Roman law bring a lawsuit against that same patron without special permission from a magistrate. If a freed person died without children, their former owner frequently retained a legal claim to a portion of their estate, meaning that even in death the relationship of ownership left behind a kind of shadow, a lingering financial connection that never fully released either party from the other. There's a detail here that tends to unsettle people once they understand it clearly, because it reveals how thoroughly Roman society had built freedom itself around continued deference rather than genuine independence. A freed person's own children, if born after manumission, were considered fully free citizens, with none of these lingering obligations, but the freed person themselves carried the mark of their former status for the rest of their life, visible in specific legal restrictions, most notably an inability to hold most public offices, and in certain periods restrictions on marrying into the Roman senatorial class, regardless of the wealth or reputation they managed to build afterward. Freedom in the fullest legal and social sense Rome recognized was something reserved for the following generation rather than something a formerly enslaved person could ever fully claim for themselves. What survives in the record suggests that many freed people nonetheless built genuinely successful lives within these constraints, and one particular figure illustrates this with unusual clarity. A man remembered by history simply as Trimalchio, though he survives to us as a fictional character in a Roman novel called the Satyricon, written by an author named Petronius, represents a real and recognizable social type from this period. The freed slave who accumulated enormous wealth through trade and shrewd business, Dealing wealthy enough to host lavish dinner parties that mocked the very aristocratic manners he could never fully be accepted into, regardless of how much money he had. The character is written as satire exaggerated for comic effect, but the social reality underneath the satire was entirely genuine. Rome's economy produced a meaningful class of formerly enslaved people who became remarkably wealthy through commerce, banking, and skilled trade. Wealthy enough in some documented cases to rival senators, and yet permanently marked in the eyes of Roman high society as having once been property, a stain that money alone could never fully wash away across a single lifetime. Is it possible, one might wonder quietly, that this partial incomplete freedom was in some ways more psychologically difficult than slavery's more obvious cruelties precisely because it offered just enough independence to make its limits feel deliberate, rather than simply circumstantial? The evidence remains incomplete regarding how freed people themselves experienced this particular tension, since very few left behind personal writing describing their in-lives in any detail. But the funerary inscriptions that survive offer a quiet, suggestive clue. Freed people commissioned gravestones for themselves at a notably higher rate than either the enslaved or freeborn citizens of comparable wealth, often listing their former status proudly alongside their new name and their trade as though the achievement of having crossed that particular threshold, however incomplete the freedom on the other side of it turned out to be, was worth commemorating permanently in stone regardless of what remained unfinished. This incompleteness, this narrow door that opened onto a room still full of walls, tells us something important about how Rome managed to sustain a system of slavery for as many centuries as it did, without it ever collapsing entirely under its own internal contradictions. It offered just enough genuine possibility of change, just enough visible examples of people who had crossed from property into something resembling personhood to make the entire arrangement feel to those still trapped inside it less like a fixed and permanent condition and more like a difficult, uncertain, but at least theoretically survivable stretch of road. Whether that hope was more often realized or more often disappointed is a question the surviving evidence cannot fully answer, buried as it is beneath centuries of silence from the millions who never left any record at all. What we can trace more clearly, however, is what remains quite literally buried beneath the ground itself, in the physical traces this entire system left behind for archaeologists to uncover many centuries later. Beneath the modern city of Rome, in a quiet residential neighbourhood that most tourists never visit, archaeologists uncovered in the 20th century a set of small underground chambers that offer one of the most intimate glimpses we have into how enslaved people themselves chose to be remembered after death. These are columbaria, communal burial chambers, lined with rows of small niches, each holding an urn containing cremated remains, and many of the ones excavated near the ancient Appian Way belonged specifically to enslaved and freed members of wealthy households, sometimes numbering in the hundreds within a single structure. What makes these spaces so quietly moving is not their scale, but their detail, because unlike the grand marble tombs of Roman senators, these modest niches were paid for, inscribed and decorated largely by the community of enslaved and freed people themselves, using whatever small savings they had managed to set aside over years of service. The inscriptions carved into these niches follow patterns that historians have only been able to piece together by examining thousands of them collectively, since no single stone tells a complete story on its own. A great many include not just a name, but a trade, baker, weaver, hairdresser, accountant, listed with what appears to be genuine pride rather than simple record-keeping, as though the skill itself hard-won and privately valuable deserved to outlast the person who had practiced it. Others include small carved symbols, a pair of shears for a barber, a loaf of bread for a baker, a simple visual shorthand that meant a person could not read the words above it, but would still understand at a glance who lay within. Scholars still debate exactly how much personal choice enslaved individuals had in designing these memorials versus how much was arranged by surviving family or fellow household members after their death. Since the enslaved person themselves obviously could not commission their own tombstone from beyond it, but the sheer consistency of certain patterns across so many different sites suggests these were not random choices. They reflect something the enslaved community itself valued and wished to preserve. Perhaps the most quietly devastating category of evidence recovered from sites like these involves inscriptions commemorating enslaved children. And the detail worth sitting with, honestly, is simply how young many of them were. Roman funerary records for enslaved children as young as 5 or 6 years old sometimes list a trade already being learned: spinning, simple errand running, assisting an older worker. Evidence that childhood in any sense a modern listener would recognize ended extremely early for those born into bondage. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how common child labor was across different types of households, since wealthier families sometimes kept enslaved children purely as companions for their own freeborn children rather than as workers, a practice that appears almost tender on its surface, and yet meant that even childhood friendship in Roman households could exist entirely within the framework of ownership, a friend who could be sold away the moment either family's circumstances changed. Physical evidence of restraint and control survives as well, and it tends to be the material that visitors to Roman archaeological sites find hardest to look at directly. Iron slave collars, several of which have been recovered largely intact from sites across the Roman world, were sometimes inscribed with short phrases identifying the wearer as a runaway, and requesting that whoever found them return the person to a named owner, offering a reward for doing so, the same practical language a person might use on a notice for a lost dog. One surviving collar, now held in a museum collection, reads simply that the wearer has fled and instructs the finder to return them for a payment of gold solidi. The owner's name included in full. It is a small object easily overlooked in a display case among more dramatic Roman artifacts, and yet it communicates in a handful of carved words an entire relationship of ownership and pursuit, more directly than any surviving literary text manages to. Shackle fragments recovered from sites including the mining regions discussed earlier in this evening's story confirm in cold physical terms what the ancient written sources only described in passing. Iron leg irons designed to restrict movement without preventing labour entirely have been found at multiple excavation sites, their sizing consistent enough that archaeologists have been able to estimate the general build of the people who wore them, evidence that lines up closely with the written accounts describing children and smaller adults being specifically selected for the narrowest mining passages. There is something particularly difficult about holding a physical shackle fragment, seeing its actual size and weight, compared to simply reading a sentence describing one. The written word can describe cruelty. The object itself confirms it happened to a specific human body, one that once had to carry that exact weight through every hour of every working day. Graffiti offers a different, in some ways more surprising category of evidence, because unlike formal inscriptions, graffiti was rarely meant to be read by anyone in a position of authority, which makes its honesty feel more unguarded. Excavations at Pompeii, preserved in remarkable detail by the very volcanic eruption that once threatened the escaped gladiators near its slopes, uncovered casual scratched writing in service corridors and slave quarters that ranges from simple names and tallies of work completed to occasional complaints about specific individuals within a household preserved entirely by accident. Because the ash that buried the city also sealed these fragile marks against centuries of weather and decay that would otherwise have erased them completely. One particularly striking piece of graffiti found in a service passage beneath a wealthy house appears to record a private joke between two enslaved household staff about a difficult guest, a small, human moment of shared humour surviving purely by chance nearly 2,000 years later. A reminder that even within a system built to erase individual personality itself proved remarkably difficult to erase entirely. Is it possible, one might wonder, that these fragments, a shackle, a collar, a scratched joke on a wall, tell us something? The formal historical record written almost entirely by wealthy Roman citizens was never designed to preserve at all. The honest answer, suggested by decades of archaeological work, is very likely yes, and this points toward one of the quieter revolutions in how historians have come to understand Roman slavery over the past several generations. For most of the modern era, our picture of this system came almost entirely from the writings of senators, philosophers, and playwrights, people who owned enslaved individuals rather than people who had been enslaved themselves, and their accounts, however detailed, inevitably carried the perspective and blind spots of their own privileged position. Archaeological evidence, precisely because it was not created for any audience at all, offers something closer to an unfiltered trace, incomplete and fragmentary, but honest in a way formal literature rarely manages to be. This shift in evidence has changed certain assumptions historians once held with real confidence. For decades, the prevailing scholarly view held that enslaved people in Roman households had little meaningful sense of collective identity, that ownership and constant surveillance prevented anything like genuine community from forming among people who might come from entirely different regions and speak different first languages. More recent archaeological work, particularly the study of burial patterns in columbaria, like the ones near the Appian Way, complicates this picture considerably. The consistency with which enslaved and freed people chose to be buried together, often in the same modest structures across multiple generations, financially supporting each other's memorials, even when not related by blood, suggests something closer to genuine chosen community than historians once assumed possible under such constrained circumstances. The most widely accepted reconstruction now holds that enslaved households, whatever their differences in origin and language, frequently developed real bonds of mutual support that outlasted individual periods of ownership, evidence for which exists largely because of where and how people chose to be buried once their working lives had finally ended. There is one further site worth including here, quieter and stranger than the rest, because it complicates any simple narrative about how completely this system controlled the people caught inside it. In the ruins of a Roman villa in the countryside outside Rome, archaeologists uncovered what appears to have been a small private shrine tucked into a corner of what would have been the household's working quarters, rather than its formal living spaces, containing a modest collection of small clay figurines representing deities not typically worshipped in mainstream Roman religion at all, but rather associated with regions across the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. The most widely accepted interpretation suggests this space was maintained by enslaved household members drawn from those regions, quietly preserving a fragment of religious practice from their original homes within a household that would have had no particular reason to object, so long as it did not interfere with their labour. It is a small, easily overlooked detail, a handful of clay figures in a corner. Most archaeologists might have walked past entirely a century ago, and yet it suggests something worth holding on to quietly tonight, that even within households built entirely around the erasure of a person's former identity, small private spaces for memory and belief occasionally quietly persisted. What all of this physical evidence adds up to, taken together, rather than piece by piece, is a picture considerably more complicated than either the cruelest accounts or the more comfortable ones the ancient literary sources sometimes offer. The shackles confirm real sustained physical suffering precisely calibrated to specific bodies and specific tasks. The collars confirm a system of pursuit and control, operating with the same practical efficiency as any modern lost property notice. And yet the graffiti, the shared burial chambers, the quiet shrine tucked into a corner of a working household, confirm something else entirely, that the people living inside this system never stopped being fully human, never stopped forming bonds, preserving memory, finding small, unguarded moments of humour and belief even under conditions built specifically to prevent exactly that. Rome's own written histories, composed almost entirely by the people who benefited from this system, left most of this invisible. It took the patient, careful work of archaeologists digging through what the ground itself had quietly preserved to bring even fragments of it back into view. And what these fragments ultimately reveal when considered as a whole rather than as scattered individual objects extends well beyond the boundaries of ancient Rome itself into questions about labour ownership and human value that would echo forward through the centuries that followed the empire's eventual collapse, shaping legal and economic systems in ways that few people looking at the modern world around them ever paused to trace back this far. Rome did not simply fall and take its institutions down with it in a single decisive moment, and this is precisely why the legacy of its slave system proved so much harder to dismantle than the empire that had built it. When the western half of the Roman world finally fragmented in the 5th century, the legal and economic structures surrounding slavery did not disappear alongside the emperors and legions. They simply changed hands, absorbed almost intact into the successor kingdoms that rose across what had once been Roman territory, carried forward by Roman law codes that continued to be copied, studied, and applied for centuries after the city of Rome itself had lost any real political power. Consider the Visigothic kingdom that eventually controlled much of Spain, one of the successor states built directly on former Roman territory. Its law code, compiled across the 6th and 7th centuries, preserved Roman legal categories around slavery almost unchanged, including specific provisions about runaway enslaved people inherited status passed down through enslaved mothers, and the particular legal disadvantages faced by freed people that we discussed earlier this evening. A Visigothic magistrate ruling on a slavery case in the year 600 was in practice still working from a legal framework that Roman jurists had developed centuries earlier, simply relabeled and lightly adjusted for a new ruling dynasty. The empire that created these categories had vanished. The categories themselves proved remarkably durable. This durability extended in ways that surprise most people encountering this history for the first time directly into the language we still speak today. The English word slave itself traces back through a long chain of medieval borrowing to the word Slav, referring to the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe who were captured and sold in enormous numbers. During the medieval period, a trade that operated along routes and using legal mechanisms directly descended from Roman commercial practice. The word for money in several European languages carries this same buried history. The Latin word pecunia, meaning wealth or money, derives from pecus, meaning livestock, reflecting an ancient Roman economy in which enslaved people like cattle functioned as a primary unit of measurable tradable wealth. Scholars still debate the precise linguistic pathway by which certain related terms evolved differently across regions, since medieval trade networks were complex and often poorly documented, but the underlying pattern of language itself, quietly preserving the economic logic of human ownership, appears consistently across multiple European tongues. Roman legal concepts around slavery also survived through an entirely different, and in some ways more surprising channel, one that reached far beyond Europe itself. When Justinian, the Eastern Roman Emperor ruling from Constantinople in the 6th century, commissioned a comprehensive compilation of Roman law known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, He preserved in careful legal detail centuries of Roman jurisprudence around ownership, manumission, and the legal status of enslaved people. This compilation became over the following 1,000 years one of the single most influential legal texts in human history, studied intensively across medieval European universities beginning in the 11th century and forming the foundational basis for what later became known as civil law. The legal tradition still followed today across most of continental Europe, Latin America, and significant portions of Africa and Asia. There is a detail here worth sitting with quietly because it connects this ancient history to something far closer to the present than most people realize. When European powers began constructing the legal frameworks that would eventually govern the transatlantic slave trade centuries later, they did not invent these frameworks from nothing. Legal scholars working in Spain, Portugal, and elsewhere across early modern Europe drew directly on Roman legal categories preserved through exactly this channel, adapting concepts like partus sequitur ventrem, the Roman principle that a child's legal status followed the status of the mother rather than the father. A rule originally developed within Roman law to manage slavery among Rome's own enslaved population, and later applied almost unchanged within colonial law across the Americas. The most widely accepted reconstruction among legal historians holds that this specific inheritance rule, which meant that a child born to an enslaved mother was automatically enslaved regardless of the father's status, represents one of the most direct and consequential lines of continuity between ancient Roman slave law and the very different, much larger system of slavery that would eventually take shape an ocean away more than 1,000 years after Rome itself had fallen. This is not to suggest a simple unbroken chain connecting Roman slavery directly to later systems in any tidy or deterministic way. The transatlantic slave trade differed from Roman slavery in profound respects, most significantly in its explicit and foundational basis in racial categorization, something Roman slavery, as we discussed earlier this evening, never organized itself around in the same systematic way. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how much later slaveholding societies consciously drew on Roman precedent versus how much they arrived independently at broadly similar legal solutions to broadly similar practical problems of controlling a captive labor force. What can be said with confidence is that the legal vocabulary, the specific mechanisms of manumission inheritance and property classification, and even certain philosophical justifications echoing the Stoic arguments we examined earlier, all passed through Roman law into the European intellectual tradition and remained available there ready to be drawn upon whenever later societies needed a ready-made legal framework for organizing human bondage. Is it possible, one might wonder, that the sheer intellectual prestige of Rome itself, the fact that educated Europeans for centuries treated Roman civilization as the pinnacle of law, philosophy, and governance, made its particular approach to slavery seem less like a moral question, requiring fresh examination, and more like an inherited, almost natural feature of any sufficiently advanced society? This question touches something important about how the institutions outlive the specific conditions that created them. Rome's slave system did not survive because later societies necessarily agreed with its underlying morality. It survived in fragments and adaptations because the legal and conceptual tools for organizing it had already been built, tested, and refined over centuries, sitting quietly available within inherited law codes and educated tradition, ready to be picked up again whenever a new society found itself, for whatever reason of its own, wanting to build something similar. Traces of this ancient system persist even in far quieter, far less consequential ways scattered across the modern world in places most people would never think to look. The layout of certain working quarters within excavated Roman villas, the narrow service corridors and hidden staircases designed specifically to keep household staff moving unseen behind the walls of a comfortable home, directly influenced the architecture of grand European houses built more than 1,000 years later, including the servants' passages and below-stairs quarters still visible in country estates across Britain, structures built by people who almost certainly never consciously connected their design choices back to ancient Rome, and yet were in a very real architectural sense still building along lines Roman households had established, centuries before their own homes were ever imagined. What remains then, once the empire itself has been gone for well over 1,000 years, is not a single clean legacy, but a scattered, uneven inheritance legal categories preserved in law books, an inheritance rule that reshaped an ocean's worth of later suffering. A word for slave itself descended from a distant, unrelated people, and small architectural habits built into houses whose owners never once considered where the pattern originated. Rome did not simply practice slavery, and then disappear from history, leaving that practice behind with it. It built carefully and over centuries an entire legal and intellectual apparatus for organizing human bondage, an apparatus sturdy enough and portable enough to be picked up by entirely different societies speaking entirely different languages, organizing their cruelty around entirely different justifications long after the last Roman emperor had lost any power to enforce a single one of the laws he had once claimed to rule by. And yet for all of this vast and scattered inheritance, for all the legal codes and words and architectural echoes that travelled forward across so many centuries, what remains most difficult to trace and perhaps most important to sit with? Honestly, before this long night story finally comes to rest, is not the system itself at all, but the individual human beings who lived and died entirely inside it, the overwhelming majority of whom left behind no legal code, no philosophical treatise, no word that entered any language, nothing at all beyond, perhaps if we are fortunate enough for the ground to have kept it safe this long, a single small trace waiting quietly to be found. The baker we met at the very start of this story, standing in the dark of his kitchen, shaping his 40th loaf before the sun had fully risen, was never a single specific person whose name survives in any surviving record. He was a composite built carefully from thousands of small archaeological and documentary fragments, just like the ones we have gathered together over these past several hours. And in that sense, he was in the truest way this kind of history can offer entirely real. He existed, perhaps not exactly as described, but in some very near form, thousands of times over, in bakeries and kitchens and mines and grand households across the entire span of the Roman world, for centuries longer than most modern nations have even existed. What we have traced tonight across the auction platforms of Delos, the silver mines of Spain, and the quiet corridors of wealthy Roman homes, the improbable uprising that briefly shook an empire's confidence, the philosophers who wrote movingly of shared humanity while never once questioning the system that made their comfort possible, and the narrow, incomplete door of freedom that some, though never enough, eventually walked through, is not really a story about ancient Rome at all, not fundamentally. It is a story about what a society is willing to build its comfort upon, and how completely a civilization can convince itself that an arrangement is simply the natural order of things, right up until the moment something forces it to look directly at what that arrangement actually costs. Rome looked away from this cost for the better part of 1,000 years. Its senators wrote philosophy in gardens tended by hands they never had to think about. Its historians recorded wars and conquests in careful, admiring detail, while the human cargo those conquests produced barely warranted a passing sentence. And yet, as we have seen tonight, the people living inside that silence were never actually silent, not entirely. They scratched their initials into prison walls. They saved coins for years to purchase a freedom that remained even once granted incomplete. They buried their dead together in modest chambers along the Appian Way, the very road that had once displayed the bodies of those who dared to imagine a different life and on those same modest gravestones they carved their trades, their names, sometimes the sound of a homeland's language beneath a Roman name that had been forced upon them. They insisted in the only ways available to them on being remembered as something more than property, even while the law that governed every hour of their lives insisted otherwise. There is one final piece of evidence worth sitting with before this long night story comes to its close, smaller and quieter than almost anything else we have examined, and yet somehow it carries the full weight of everything that came before it. Among the thousands of Roman funerary inscriptions that survive from across the empire, a certain phrase appears again and again carved onto stones marking graves both free and enslaved alike. A simple formula so common that scholars have given it its own abbreviated shorthand in modern academic writing. It reads in its fullest form, I was not, I was, I am not, I do not care. 4 short statements moving from non-existence into life out of life into death and ending, finally in something that reads almost like peace. Historians still debate exactly how this phrase was intended, whether as genuine Epicurean philosophy suggesting death holds no sting for those who no longer exist to feel it, or simply as a common, almost formulaic way of marking an ending without excessive grief. What makes it worth holding onto tonight is that this exact phrase appears on the gravestones of senators and on the gravestones of enslaved people in equal measure, carved with the same words in the same simple Latin, over people whose lives could not have been more different from one another in every single way that mattered while they were living them. Perhaps that is the truest thing this entire evening's story can offer in the end. Rome built an entire civilization on the deliberate systematic difference between one kind of person and another, encoded that difference into its laws, its markets, its architecture, its philosophy, its very language. And yet in the one place where every distinction Rome had built finally stopped mattering, the simple stone marking where a body was laid to rest, the words carved there did not know the difference. I was not. I was. I am not. I do not care. The same 4 sentences over an emperor's daughter and over a woman who had spent her entire life kneading bread in the dark for someone else's table. This is where a story like this one tends to settle quietly into something worth carrying into sleep tonight. Empires rise on the backs of people history rarely bothers to name, and empires fall eventually, every single one of them. The way Rome itself eventually did. Its legions gone, its senators' villas fallen into ruin, its laws surviving only in fragments picked through by scholars centuries later. Power, however, total it feels while it holds, is temporary. It always has been. What outlasts it more often than the histories written by the powerful ever expect is something smaller and steadier. A name scratched into a prison wall, a shared grave chosen freely by people who had chosen very little else in their lives. A joke written on a wall by 2 friends who never expected anyone to read it 2,000 years later. We do not know most of their names. This has been true throughout tonight's story, and it remains true at its ending. The baker, the boy sent into a mining tunnel too narrow for a grown man. The woman examined on a platform at Delos the countless people who walked briefly alongside Spartacus and then disappeared entirely from any surviving record. Most of them left nothing behind that a modern voice can speak aloud tonight. And yet they were here. They breathed the same morning air we breathe now. They felt tired in the evenings the way we do. They loved people sometimes within the very household that owned them, and they were loved in return, however imperfectly, however constrained by a system built to make that love conditional and temporary. They mattered to someone even when Rome's own laws insisted they did not matter at all. History is often kindest to the people who left the most behind: the senators, the generals, the emperors whose names still echo through every account of this period. But the actual weight of a civilization, the labour that built its roads and its comfort and its quiet mornings, rested on people who left almost nothing behind at all. That imbalance is itself a kind of history worth sitting with honestly in the dark before sleep finally comes. Somewhere outside Rome, along a stretch of the old Appian Way that modern visitors now walk quietly among pine trees, and broken stone archaeologists still occasionally uncover small fragments, a shard of pottery, a corner of an inscription too worn to read in full a single bead from a necklace long since scattered. Most of these fragments will never be connected to a name. Most of them will simply be catalogued quietly and placed carefully into storage, one small piece among many thousands of others exactly like it. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps a name was never the point. A person lived. A person worked in the dark before the sun rose for someone else's table. A person hoped in whatever quiet way was still available to them for something better than the day they were living. The road is still there. The stones remember in their own patient, silent way, even when we cannot. Somewhere beneath old pine trees, where the Appian Way runs quiet and empty, now a small piece of pottery still waits in the soil, unnamed, unhurried, simply waiting to be found.